Once you've lost your weight, how do you manage it? How do you maintain it? How do you eat to a point where you can actually still go out with friends and enjoy food and enjoy yourself? What are the thoughts associated with your eating disorder? What are some of the behaviors that are perpetuating it? And are there any other concerns that we think we need to manage? Maybe more about your preoccupation with food that we need to look at so we can get you back to a more balanced approach of seeing yourself, not just as a certain weight or shape, but more than that.
What would be the take-home message for parents and maybe adults that may have questions around eating disorders or might hear some of this stuff and find it resonates with them to some degree?
But Rich, good to see you. How are you?
One thing I'd like to bring up is the website that you have. Through your website, clients can see a bit about yourself. There's some video recordings of yourself to get to better know you. But there's a key aspect that I'd like to talk about today, which is with reference to eating disorders. Right. There's some content about that. Why don't we talk a little bit about what eating disorders are?
Yeah.
Maybe don't know.
Eating disorders, if I had to use one word to explain it, would be chaos. Chaos.
Right.
And it's like hurricane. And not only is the person stuck in the hurricane that has the eating disorder, people around them are also caught up in the hurricane.
Yeah.
So not only do people that have the disorder go through distress, which is the cardinal symptom of any disorder or syndrome, people around them also go through distress. So it's not the most glamorous word to use, and I can understand how it can be a little bit, it's kind of like, talking about the disorder in a negative term, but it can be chaos and it can be chaotic. It's the only disorder that has one of the highest levels of mortality, where people who suffer for a long period of time usually can die from the disorder or take their own life from the disorder,
Right.
or refuse treatment.
Yeah.
So when they get to a phase, so for anorexia, if they get below a certain BMI, which is usually 18, but people can get to a lot lower. So, for example, what would a BMI of 18 be? Now, it'd probably be about 5'4", 5'5", with a weight of about 46 kilos.
Yep.
It's very thin, very emaciated, fragile. And 46 kilos is probably still quite healthy to some degrees, even though it's not really, it's below body weight. We could see below 38 kilos. And one of the most important parts of treatment then is actually trying to get weight back to some healthy range. And there are a small subset of clients that will maybe refuse that treatment.
Yeah.
So it can be quite chaotic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You also mentioned anorexia, implying that's one kind of eating disorder. What other eating disorders are there?
All right, so anorexia nervosa is probably one of the more traditionally known eating disorders because it's overt. You can see from the person's weight and shape, it's very thin, sunken in cheekbones. There can be changes to the complexion, to the hair, because there's obviously absence of nutrients. Other disorders that are more camouflaging, believe it or not, would be something like bulimia nervosa, where it's not directly observable through weight, but it's more understood through behaviors. And some of the behaviors with bulimia nervosa are about the person will eat and then would have this fear. And it's probably important to mention here that back in the early 2000s, one of the researchers, Chris Fairburn and colleagues, they come up with what they believe to be what's called common denominator in all eating disorders, and that is body weight and shape. So people that are quite preoccupied with their body weight and shape, they have a tendency to be more prone to try to change how they eat or their relationship with food. So someone with bulimia nervosa may eat a certain amount of food, then they might feel a certain amount of regret, shame, or guilt, and they try to obviously somehow neutralize that. And that could be done through excessive exercise, laxatives, self-induced vomiting, which is called purging. So that's a very common form of eating disorder, but it's harder to detect because the cardinal thing there that doctors might see is that their body weight's normal. And you see this on the opposite spectrum with males that have eating or disordered eating. They can be quite muscular, and muscularity is symbolic with health. So a GP would never probe this. And what's more important is that the first line of treatment normally starts in the GP clinic, because the person that's going for treatment actually isn't going for the treatment of the eating disorder. It's other things that are occurring in the background, like family stress, depressive symptoms. So it's well known that if a person has an eating disorder, there's a high chance they'll have some other form of disorder. So they may be seeing a GP for, say, for example, depressive symptoms or anxiety or some form of interpersonal conflict. And the GP has a look at them through what we call the mental state examination and says, well, they look like they're below a certain weight for their age. And then they start to probe. But the client or the person sitting in that chair, they're not there because of their weight. So we call that ego symptotic. That means they don't think they have a problem with their weight, or they don't have a problem with their eating, or they don't have a problem with the relationship they have with food.
Yeah.
That's what makes it one of the most difficult and hardest disorders to treat,
Yeah.
is that inability to have that insight that there is something problematic about their relationship with food.
Right. Okay. So it's very difficult to identify right from that first wave of
Correct.
Yeah.
So we have anorexia nervosa, which can be easily identified visually through the person not being at healthy weight. Bulimia nervosa, which is more about some Q&A. And then we have binge eating disorder, which is very similar to bulimia nervosa, but those type of compensatory behaviors induced by guilt or shame, they don't appear to be there. So the person will have, well, to be honest, the research says they don't appear to be there. But what normally happens after a binge eating episode, and just quickly what a binge eating episode is, if there's parents listening, because they're really the people I want to educate, because believe it or not, eating disorders will go undetected for about 10 years. So they normally start at about, for females, about 10, 9 years old. Happen to also coincide with puberty, which is a very curious development period. With males, they are prone to eating disorders, but a lot less than females. Now, there's some talk about how males may go less undiscovered because of maybe stigma, or they don't think it's a male-orientated type of disorder. I don't think so. I think there is a ratio and the disparity or an asymmetry between females and males, and I think females are more prone to eating types of concerns. But they can go for 10 years before even seeking treatment, and normally when they do seek treatment, it's for another thing.
Yeah.
The danger there is psychology's become more, and so policy and legislation has become more around preventive measures. So we try to look at what can we do in school, maybe to help reduce person experiencing a depressive episode, or how do we get them to manage anxiety? So we look at preventative measures. We do it with sleep. We try to do it with eating. It just doesn't seem to work because people aren't coming forward. So it's very hard to put some of those preventative measures in place, which might actually change the course of something that's subclinical, not clinical, which we call disordered, on a continuum becoming obviously a diagnostic type of disorder like anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder.
Right. So the fact that there is, going back to your previous point, is the delay in being able to pick various eating disorders can come 10 plus years later. So you've got particular treatments that you can utilize. But let's talk about age for a second here. What are the different treatment modalities if you say are treating an adult with an eating disorder versus someone like a child or a teenager where you're able to intercept it early?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll tell you why that's a great question. There was a popular American singer and songwriter by the name of Karen Carpenter, and they made a movie about her. And it used a bit of an old psychodynamic theme where a lot of the treatment resolved around family therapy, that there was some form of conflict between the person with the disorder and their family members, usually something to do with the person didn't feel good enough, the person didn't feel adequate, and they felt that they couldn't control some of these things in their environment. And one of the theories at that time, and it still is a theory to a degree, is that the person can't control their external world, but one thing they can control is their internal world. And this therapy was more around trying to aggregate the family and the client together. Now, that therapy was probably right on track, because now what we look at when a child or an adolescent has some form of disordered eating, or in a worst case scenario, if it meets a clinical diagnosis, is that we want the family to help with the management of their eating regimen. We want the family to be involved in helping prepare their foods. And we do it through some form of systematic therapy where the parents take over the way that the child eats to a point where they can relinquish that back to the child or adolescent. With adults, that can be more difficult to do because they might not be living at home. They might be living on their own, or they might be, in a relationship with another person, and it might be a bit difficult to do that. So we will default back to more CBT types of methods of therapy. That's about what are the thoughts associated with your eating disorder? What are some of the behaviors that are perpetuating it? And are there any other concerns that we think we need to manage? Maybe more about your preoccupation with food that we need to look at so we can get you back to a more balanced approach of seeing yourself, not just as a certain weight or shape, but more than that.
Right. So then to follow up on that point, given that you have to account for lively circumstances between a child living with family versus an adult that might be living independently, and how you're tailoring those two treatment modalities, what are the overall success rates then if we're comparing, say, younger folk to older folk?
It's a great question. And yet again, I keep saying it's a great question because it is a great question. The research here is still a little bit in its infancy because we really haven't done a lot of these types of studies where we get in early before we see a disorder and we implement some form of treatment when they might have high levels of disordered eating. So we do something what's called the Eating Disorders Examination Questionnaire, which is the gold standard, and you may score highly on that. Now, this technically is a clinical diagnostic tool. You can actually say that someone fits the criteria of an eating disorder, but it gives you a score for what their eating is like across a few dimensions, like restrictive eating, how they perceive their weight, control of weight, how they perceive their shape. And yet again, I use that word perceive because I think eating disorders has a perceptive component to it. I've done in the clinic here, I'll ask a client, go to the door, and I'll go to the door and I'll start from here. And I'm going to move my right hand close to my left hand. I want you to tell me when to stop when I think that your left hand and right hand, my left hand and my right hand equal the distance between your left hip and your right hip. Now, some of these clients probably like this. They will tell me prematurely to stop around here. So the way they perceive themselves in their mind is very different to the way they are physically or perceived by others, which may mean why they have this strong desire to continue to change weight and shape, because their starting point of how they see themselves is way out of line to how they actually physically are. And that's another component that's very difficult to treat. Now, taking all this into account, getting in early, doing the intervention, looking at the perceptive distortions, if we do get in early, there is a success rate with treatment. If we get in late, depending on some of the severity of how much body weight's been lost, whether or not it's their second, third time that they've actually tried to restore body weight and they've maybe been in remission or they relapse, that can mean that it could be a lot more difficult. So because we really haven't seen some good longitudinal studies that show preventative ways of dealing with it, because people don't usually put their hand up and say, I want to be part of the study. So we don't really know. But what we do know is that if we start treating people before, say, 25 to 30, and they've only experienced the eating disorder for a few years, and they've only got to a point where they've had an unhealthy body weight once, and they haven't relapsed for, say, a year or 2 years, those people have a lot more success than people that have maybe relapsed once, twice, three times, and at an older age. So these are factors. And the problem is with some of the research is, how long do we follow up these clients for? Like, everyone talks about randomized controlled trials where we look at different therapies for different disorders, and we look at it straight after the 12 weeks of treatment. Mind you, this 12 weeks of treatment doesn't match what happens in clinic either.
Yes.
So Medicare, how wonderful it is. We do 60 minutes, one session, maybe a week or a fortnight. When we do a randomized control trial, we might be doing 6 hours a week of treatment. Now that will absorb your Medicare in 2 weeks. So we're comparing very different types of conditions to what happens in the clinic, which we call clinic utility. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. Yes, therapy works. Medication, most of the evidence suggests it can help, but only in certain aspects. Social support, family network, these things help a lot. If we get in early and the child or the adolescent is at an age where they've got some flexibility about wanting to change and realizing that they have maybe a disordered way of seeing the way they eat and their relationship with food, then therapy can be quite successful. So it's time point, it's time entry. If we get in a little bit later,
Yeah.
not to say that therapy doesn't work, it can, but the chances or probability of it working is less than if we got in earlier.
Yeah. Early interception is key.
Correct.
Yeah.
But with any disorder,
Of course.
with any disorder.
Absolutely.
And it's funny because eating disorders somehow have a bit of a parallel to OCD. Most people with OCD do not seek clinical treatment till about 10 years into their disorder.
Similar timeline.
Yeah, and they do, difference is OCD is more ego dystonic, where that person knows, I know this is a little bit silly what I'm doing, but I struggle not to do it. And it starts to build up to it and interferes with their life with time. Eating disorder is not much different. There's a lot of time invested in not eating food. There's a lot of time in doing body surveillance. There's a lot of time in avoiding eating food. Then these things build and build to the point where the stress takes over and the person then is experiencing other symptoms that they seek treatment for.
Right.
So it's not uncommon for a long chronic period of time to occur and the person is actually getting secondary symptoms primarily from what we think might have been the primal disorder being the eating issue.
Yeah. How fascinating. So that gives a lot of people at home a lot of insight into eating disorders and so forth, right? To a degree.
It does. So, for example, I'm a parent, and just say I notice my son Cruz. He's starting to ask questions about calories around food. Does that mean I should be concerned? No, because that could just also mean healthy eating or wanting to know the macronutrient content of food. That's not disordered. Okay. However, if he starts avoiding eating that food for prolonged periods of time because he sees that food to be bad, he sees that food to have some form of, catastrophic effect on his body weight and shape, sure, that can enter the field of disorder because there's a restriction there.
Right.
If he starts to reduce the frequency of eating when he's hungry, so avoiding food even in the presence of hunger, then sure, that could mean there is elements of disordered eating. So what research does know that one of the leading indicators to an eating disorder can be early diet history. And even that word diet, it can be it's synonymous with restriction. And restriction works, unfortunately. But we talk yet again, like in the evolutionary psychology realm, that it's trade-offs. If I don't eat food, I will lose weight. And I understand why clients do it. It works. And too many psychologists say you shouldn't not eat food. I don't think they're wrong, but I think the better way to explain it to a client is restricting food and not eating food works. But what we call in the short term. In the long term, it creates more problems. It's not sustainable. It's something that you can't actually continue to do. You'll start getting fatigued. You'll start not getting your nutrients that you need. You'll have a reduction in body weight that's excessive that starts to shut off the way your hormones work. So for some females, they may lose the ability to have their menstrual cycle. For some males, their libido can drop, their testosterone can drop rapidly. So these things can be quite catastrophic. Constant fatigue, not being able to concentrate, changes in their hair, their skin, changes in their odor, changes in certain way that their blood chemistry can work, their immunity, more susceptible to illness. So these are the trade-offs. And the question is, how do you know to pull back then? Once you've lost your weight, how do you manage it? How do you maintain it? How do you eat to a point where you can actually still go out with friends and enjoy food and enjoy yourself? Food is one of our primal sources of pleasure. And there's probably a reason for it because it reinforces the behavior of eating because it increases survival to the point where if we can survive long enough, we can reproduce, which comes down to sex. So sex and food are very important. They seem to be somewhat imprinted in these subcortical areas of the brain. And what I've noticed is when people somehow reduce one or the other, there's usually something distressful in their makeup.
Right. Yeah. How fascinating. And this, again, going back to your previous point, is you'd almost look at restricted eating as a form of a brief intervention. It can be useful, but it's the long-term effects you have to be cautious of if you maintain that behavior over time.
And most dieting, it's all about restricting, reducing the amount of solid food or replacing it with a liquid food, skipping meals, fasting. In my opinion, these aren't required. There's some fascinating research done in 2018 where people followed a tribe that were kind of like partial hunters and gatherers, partial settlers, and all they ate was honey. So for the people that are anti-carbs out there and carbs are bad, well, okay, let's see how bad it was. So these researchers looked at the triglyceride and fat level of these people. Comparison to a control group in Western society. These guys they were better eating honey. Then they looked at cardiac markers, like, for example, the amount of statins for blood pressure, heart rate, cardiovascularity, VO2 output, all these types of things. Tribal group win again. What's going on? Then the researchers found there was a confounding variable, that these primitive tribes, they were doing around. So what do you think the average amount of exercise reported to the Western world is that they should do weekly?
It's a good question. I'm not sure, but I'd imagine it'd have to be up to 30 minutes daily, something along those lines.
30 minutes, 4 days a week, getting probably an average heart rate between, say, 120 to maybe 160. So that would mean 2 hours. The interesting thing that come out of this type of what we might call a naturalistic type of study or cross-sectional study was that most of the tribe members were doing 20 hours a week of exercise where their heart rate was above 160. So then the researchers thought, let's take it a step further. Let's see whether or not, on average, based on translations appropriate for that culture and words appropriate. Now, I don't know the types of measurements they use, but they were able to make this distinction. What are their anxiety and depression like in comparison to Western world? And yet again, they were lower. And is that a surprise? Maybe not, because if you look at the research, say, for example, if you go into a Cochrane review or a website, the number one thing, apart from pharmacological interventions for depression, is exercise or activity scheduling. So the interesting thing that came out of this was that looking at macronutrients and calling certain things bad might not be helpful. Restricting food might not be helpful. Maybe what's better is to look at, what do I eat? Are there small things that I can change instead of eliminate? And how active am I? Because what comes in, what goes out, it's also about, the definition of a calorie is how much water, or I think it's, raising 1 degree of water by 1 degree Celsius to burn a calorie, right? So maybe we look at different ways about physical activity, because physical activity has all these other benefits. So I think maybe that's some of the things that we try to work out. Like, for example, when we see a client that has normally some disordered eating patterns, can we give them other frameworks or perspectives of reaching a certain goal, because they'll have a goal. And sure, some of them might be a little bit overweight, but the goal isn't to lose the weight. The goal is to get to where you want to, but be able to healthily maintain it where it doesn't interrupt or create distress for you or your interpersonal relationships.
So if we were to wrap things up, especially for viewers at home, what would be the take-home message for parents and maybe adults that may have questions around eating disorders, or might hear some of this stuff and find it resonates with them to some degree?
Well, number one, you can always ring me. I'll always answer my phone, and I'm happy to have a 10, 15-minute chat because I enjoy doing this. And I think for the clients that have already come here, they know that I will do that. So if you're a concerned parent, pick up the phone. If you're just not at that level yet, but you're kind of like a little bit curious of what your child's doing, some of the things you should look out for: eating alone, not eating at the dinner table, eating in secrecy, always constantly looking or talking about their weight and shape, not seeing what they eat, not being able to visualize what they eat, dramatic loss of weight, concealing clothing. Now, that's not to say that children without any form of disordered eating don't do some of this either, because some kids go and eat in their bedroom or be playing computer games and they might go without food for 12 hours. But that's not a deliberate attempt to restrict food. That's because their attention has unfortunately gone into a virtual realm where they might forget about food. We're kind of talking more where the person's deliberately, with intent, trying to withhold or reduce the amount of food they're eating because they want to change their weight or shape. So parents probably should be looking for really conscious efforts against hunger signals where they're trying to control, reduce, or somewhat manipulate their weight and shape. People with disordered eating and eating disorders It's not that they mean to, it's not done deliberately, it's not because they're trying to tell a couple of white lies. It's because they find it so important that they have to do certain behaviors that they don't want other people to interfere with it because in their mind, what you see is different to what they see. So there's a tendency for the child maybe to misguide their parents and saying, I did eat at lunchtime today, but they really put their food in the bin. So if a parent does hear that and has some curiosity, then maybe, there's some good websites you can look at. There's other websites that Australian renowned, like I think the Butterfly Foundation. It's got some great information on eating disorders. Or you can ring up someone, or I'm happy for people to ring me up, and we can say, okay, is this something that we need to look a little bit more closer in? And it may be challenging to get their child to come here. And so what I normally say to parents is that why don't we go for 10 or 15 minutes? If you're not happy and you're not comfortable, you can leave anytime. The consent lies with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
Well, thank you for your time, Matt.
No, you're welcome.